They stole my land and built a resort on it. You heard that right. 84 cabins on my family's ranch. While I was away serving in Washington, D.C., and when I came back, they pointed a gun at me and told me to leave. Welcome to HOA Karen Files, the channel that brings you real stories of HOA greed, neighbor nightmares, and the sweet sound of legal revenge. Hit subscribe and buckle up, because this war just got personal. HOA built 84 vacation cabins on my ranch and called me a trespasser. After 3 relentless years in Washington, where I worked 16-hour days drafting the Federal Land Access and Conservation Act, I finally came home. The bill had passed. My work, meticulous, technical, often thankless, was done. All I wanted was to breathe mountain air again, to feel the soil beneath my boots, to walk among the pines that had watched over my family for 3 generations. The Westbrook Ranch, 600 acres of forested hills and open fields nestled in Evergreen County, had been ours since the 1940s. My grandfather bought it with the kind of stubborn pride only a man raised in the Depression could understand. My father expanded it in the 1980s. I inherited it 5 years ago when they passed. Through all that time, it had remained untouched, sacred land, preserved with love, memory, and promise. But as I drove down the familiar dirt path leading up to the East Ridge, the same path I had ridden on horseback as a boy, I felt something was wrong. The road, once lined with wild shrubs and mossy fence posts, was now freshly paved. Streetlights stood at perfect intervals. I slowed the truck, narrowing my eyes. Then I saw it. Cabins, dozens of them. Rustic, yes, but modern. Too clean, too new. They stretched across land that used to be my family's hayfield. A place I remembered watching fireflies dance with my sister on warm summer nights. Now it looked like a resort brochure. I kept driving, disoriented, until a gate blocked my way. It was a large iron structure with an electronic scanner and a sign that read, Whispering Pines HOA, private property, residents, and guests only. A guard stepped out of a booth beside the gate, uniformed, armed. He looked at me with the kind of suspicion you reserve for trespassers, not landowners. Can I help you, sir? I leaned out the window. Yeah, I live here, or at least I used to. This is the Westbrook Ranch. My name's Max Westbrook. He didn't flinch. Sir, this is Whispering Pines Private Development. If you don't have a guest pass or proof of residence, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I stared at him, at the sign, at the cabins behind him. Something inside me shifted, a deep, slow burn that started in my chest and crawled toward my throat. You're saying I'm trespassing? On my own damn land? I'm saying you're not authorized to enter this property. Call the sheriff if you want to dispute that. So I did. Sheriff Tom Wilkins had been in office for 22 years. He was an old friend of my father, and he recognized me the moment I walked into his station. Max Westbrook, I thought you were still up in D.C. playing lawyer. I came home, I said, but apparently I don't own it anymore. He raised an eyebrow. I explained what I'd seen. The cabins, the gate, the guard who threatened to call him on me. Tom leaned back in his chair, frowning. That development's been going up for almost 2 years. Whispering Pines filed easement claims, got fast-tracked approval. Councilman Redfield signed off on it himself. I felt the blood drain from my face. Easement claims? They filed access rights over my land? He nodded. It's all in the county records. Says they were granted an access corridor and limited use development rights. He paused, suddenly wary. You didn't approve any of that? Tom, I said flatly. The man who supposedly granted those rights, my grandfather, has been dead for 20 years. He went quiet. I drove straight to the county clerk's office. It took some convincing, but the staff let me into the records archive. I found the documents easily. Too easily. They were new, filed just under 2 years ago. Signed, stamped, certified. I looked at the signature on the main easement approval form. It was shaky, off. The kind of signature you get when someone is trying to imitate another from memory. I pulled out my phone and took photos. Every page, every stamp, every falsified approval. Back at the ranch house, I sat in the dark for a long time. My father once told me, "The law protects those who know how to wield it." He taught me that justice was rarely given. It was taken back with knowledge and patience and grit. I didn't know exactly what had happened yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Someone had stolen my land, and they were about to learn who they stole it from. The next morning, I was at the county courthouse before sunrise. Evergreen County's records office sat inside a squat, beige building that hadn't changed since my father's time. The interior smelled like dust, toner, ink, and stale coffee. The clerk on duty, Janice, was the same woman who used to sell raffle tickets at the county fair. She recognized me instantly. "Max? Well, I'll be." "You're back," she said, eyebrows raised. "Didn't expect to see you digging through easement files on your first day home." "Didn't expect to be fighting for my own land," I replied. With Tom Wilkins' verbal clearance, Janice let me behind the counter and into the archive room. I spent the better part of 6 hours combing through everything Whispering Pines HOA had filed with the county over the past 2 years. They had paperwork for everything: development permits, construction zoning changes, environmental impact statements, and, most damning of all, a sweeping easement agreement that gave them rights over nearly 40 acres of my property. The alleged signatory? My grandfather, in 2023. The man had passed away in 2002. He'd never used a computer, let alone DocuSign. The dates were all wrong, the font styles inconsistent, but the county had stamped them as valid. That told me two things. One, someone had forged those documents. Two, someone inside the county had either missed it or let it happen. I took copies of everything and drove straight to the old Westbrook Ranch house, still dusty and abandoned since my parents passed. I had kept the utilities running, the taxes paid, but I hadn't expected to return to a war zone. I made coffee, sat at the old oak table in the kitchen, and laid out the files. The picture was getting clearer. Whispering Pines wasn't just a rogue HOA, it was a front, likely for a developer. The speed, the coordination, the strategic location. It wasn't amateur hour. They were professionals, and they'd made a critical error. They didn't know whose land they'd stolen. The next step was obvious. I needed an ally. So I picked up the phone and called Olivia Carr, a former student of mine from my teaching stint at Georgetown Law. Smart, thorough, and fearless. She'd gone on to become a rising star in land rights litigation and had once successfully taken on a state agency for environmental negligence. I didn't have to explain much. The moment I mentioned forged easement and HOA takeover, she was already packing a bag. By the next day, Olivia was at the ranch with a duffel bag, a laptop, a stack of case law, and a fire in her eyes. "Professor Westbrook," she said, stepping into the dusty foyer, "I've waited years for a case like this." "Call me Max," I said, "and I think we're about to make some noise." Olivia and I went to work. We cataloged every signature, every permit, every approval. She mapped the property lines using satellite imagery in GIS software, cross-referencing with the county's own zoning database. By sundown, we'd found a dozen irregularities. Some of the survey data had been copied verbatim from a neighboring property. One set of signatures used a notary stamp registered to a woman who hadn't lived in Evergreen County since 2015. One of the parcel numbers listed in the permit didn't even exist. It was a patchwork of sloppy lies held together by bureaucratic laziness or corruption. "That's not just negligence," Olivia said, tapping her screen. "That's organized fraud." We suspected a connection with the county council. Olivia did some digging and found the link. Councilman Carl Redfield. Redfield had pushed through the Whispering Pines development proposal during a so-called expedited review session. No public notice, no resident input, just a rubber stamp and a signature. He was also the recipient of a generous campaign donation from a company called Blackridge Holdings, LLC. A little more research revealed that Blackridge owned the development rights to several properties surrounding my ranch. The same company also had ties to a local real estate magnate named Eleanor Quinn, a woman known for flipping rural land into luxury communities, often under the guise of eco-friendly development. Olivia leaned back in her chair. "This is deeper than we thought. This isn't just a case of forged paperwork. This is a coordinated land grab. That night, I took a walk out to the ridge, the same ridge where, as a kid, I used to sit beside my dad and watch the sunset roll over the treetops. I remembered how he once told me, "Land doesn't lie, Max. People do. But the land, it remembers." And right now the land was calling out, calling for justice. I looked out at the cabins, rows of warm lights twinkling from porches that had no right to exist. Families were inside, sipping wine, watching TV, completely unaware they were living on stolen soil. And I didn't blame them. Not yet. They were pawns in someone else's game. But I knew one thing for sure. Eleanor Quinn had picked the wrong ranch. The next morning, I filed a formal claim of ownership dispute with the Evergreen County Recorder's Office, attaching a letter of intent to pursue civil and criminal legal action. Olivia contacted the State Attorney General's office with preliminary evidence of document forgery and corruption. We were just getting started. We didn't have all the answers yet, but we had the truth. And truth, in the hands of the right people, is a damn good weapon. Especially when you know the law better than your enemies. Especially when you wrote it. By the time our complaint hit the county recorder's inbox, the Whispering Pines HOA had already sensed trouble. Within 48 hours, I received a thick envelope delivered by courier to the ranch house. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter, 5 pages of legal threats, citations, and accusations. They claimed I was harassing their residents, endangering public peace, and unlawfully interfering with a legally recognized homeowners association. The letter was signed by Eleanor Quinn, president of the Whispering Pines HOA and CEO of Blackridge Holdings. She wasn't hiding anymore, and her message was clear: back off, or we'll bury you in paperwork and lawsuits. The next morning, my driveway was blocked. 3 massive pine trees had been cut down overnight, deliberately felled to form a barricade across my only vehicle-accessible route into town. Chainsaw marks were fresh. I found boot prints in the mud and tire tracks that led straight to the HOA's maintenance road. No one claimed responsibility, of course. When I called the sheriff's department, they sent a deputy who took some photos and made vague notes. But I could tell he wasn't eager to pick a fight with Whispering Pines. Not without explicit orders from Sheriff Wilkins. Later that day, I drove into town using the back trail, a winding, treacherous ATV path my father had carved years ago during a particularly brutal winter. It hadn't been used in over a decade, but that day it became my lifeline. I stopped at the feed store, bought coffee at the corner diner, and waited. And sure enough, people noticed. A few locals greeted me with cautious nods. Some avoided eye contact altogether. The story was spreading, and I wasn't the hero. I was the outsider, the angry landowner, the man threatening the peaceful new community in the hills. Eleanor's PR machine had fired its opening salvo. That night, we found their weapon of choice, a local blog post titled, "Man Claims Land from Families After 20 Years Away. Is Whispering Pines Under Siege?" It was clearly written by someone working for the HOA, or worse, someone being paid by them. It described me as a former federal bureaucrat from D.C., accused me of trying to displace families who bought their homes in good faith, and suggested I was leveraging obscure legal loopholes to steal back land that had been legally acquired through public processes. Olivia was furious. "They're painting you as a villain, and they're doing it fast. They're controlling the narrative," and I said, "We need to take that away from them." We built a website that same night, westbrookranchtruth.org. It told our story from the beginning, published copies of the suspicious easement documents, highlighted my grandfather's death certificate, and included satellite photos showing the construction timeline on my land. Olivia recorded a short video interview with me. Simple, honest, no editing tricks. We weren't just fighting in court anymore. We were fighting in public. While I handled the local noise, Olivia kept digging. She focused on Councilman Redfield, the man who had pushed through the development approvals. She discovered something interesting. A shell company called Hollow Creek Investments, registered under a P.O. box in another county, had been quietly acquiring parcels of land adjacent to Whispering Pines. Hollow Creek had the same accountant as Blackridge Holdings. And Redfield. He had received multiple campaign donations from both entities in the last 2 years, always just below the legal reporting threshold. It was a web, one we could trace, one we could unravel, but we needed a witness. That's when Olivia had a brilliant idea. Surveyors, she said, the people who marked the land boundaries, someone had to file those forged plats. If we can find the one who drew them, someone on the inside who got cold feet, we might have a way in. HOA, his name was Frank Delgado, a licensed land surveyor with a spotless reputation, until 2 years ago, when he started taking freelance contracts from developers. We tracked him down to a small office above a tax prep firm on the edge of town. When I walked in, he looked up from his desk and froze. "Mr. Westbrook," he said, "I didn't expect—" "Just a few questions," I interrupted. "Off the record." Frank tried to deny everything at first. But Olivia had come prepared, with records of his name on the forged easement filings, time-stamped GPS logs from the county site, and copies of 3 other surveys he had signed off on, all linked to Whispering Pines. When she mentioned federal fraud statutes and offered him a seat at the right end of the prosecution table, he cracked. "I didn't know it was your land," he muttered, visibly sweating. "They told me it was a formality. They said the documents had already been approved by the family, that you weren't interested anymore." "They paid you?" I asked. He nodded. "Cash, in an envelope, twice. The rest was under a consulting contract from Hollow Creek." Olivia leaned forward. "We need you, Frank, not just for testimony, for the whole playbook. Show us how they did this, and who else is involved." He hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a black notebook. "Everything's in here," he whispered. "Every coordinate, every call, every mistake." Back at the ranch, we laid out Frank's notes like evidence in a trial. He had detailed how Eleanor's team had bribed low-level clerks, faked boundary disputes, and created layers of legal obfuscation to hide the fraud. It was airtight, and it was just the beginning. We drafted a 37-page affidavit and submitted it to the state attorney general's office, formally requesting an investigation into forgery of legal documents, fraudulent use of public records, illegal land development under false pretense, public corruption and campaign finance violations. Then we sent the same file to every news outlet within a 3-county radius. We didn't ask them to take sides. We just gave them the story and let the truth speak for itself. That night, I returned to the Overlook Ridge. The lights of Whispering Pines were still glowing. But this time, I didn't feel anger or loss. I felt momentum. They wanted me gone. They wanted me intimidated. But what they really did was wake up the wrong man. It started with a voicemail. "Mr. Westbrook," the voice said, low and urgent. "My name is Carol Anderson. I think something similar happened to us." She gave no details, just an address. Then she hung up. I stared at my phone. We were no longer alone. Carol Anderson lived 2 counties over, a modest home, weathered porch, and a framed wedding photo that hadn't moved from the wall in 50 years. Her husband, John, had passed just months after they lost their family farm. "Eleanor Quinn made us an offer," she told me. "Said the land was unusable, said permits would never go through, said we'd face legal challenges for years unless we sold." Carol's voice trembled, but her eyes held firm. "When we refused, we got hit with zoning violations, water code citations, even an environmental inspection claiming our septic system was endangering a creek 2 miles away. Within 6 months, they sold. 3 months after that, the violations mysteriously disappeared, and luxury condos appeared where their barn used to stand. It was the same pattern: isolate, intimidate, acquire. But hearing it from Carol made it real. Eleanor hadn't just stolen my land. She had a system and a list of victims, and we were about to blow it wide open. With Carol's sworn affidavit and Frank Delgado's notebook, Olivia compiled a federal-level case file. She sent it to a contact at the DOJ, someone I'd worked with during the drafting of the Land Access Act. The reply came in less than 24 hours. "We're opening a preliminary investigation. Your evidence is strong. Keep gathering." It wasn't a green light yet, but it was close. In the meantime, our website had gone viral. Local news had picked it up, followed by state media. I did my first live interview on the courthouse steps, standing next to Carol. The people of Whispering Pines deserve to know the truth, I said, looking straight into the camera. This isn't about development. It's about deception. It's about fraud. And it ends now. By nightfall, my inbox was flooded with more messages. My parents were pressured to sell under false pretenses. We were told the zoning was unsafe. Then they built a shopping plaza. She threatened to sue us into bankruptcy if we didn't sell. Names, dates, locations, proof. Olivia created a secure database and began sorting everything by region and timeline. And the name Eleanor Quinn appeared again and again. She didn't stay silent for long. 3 days after the media frenzy, Whispering Pines held an emergency town hall meeting at their community clubhouse. Residents, journalists, and more than a few curious neighbors showed up. And Eleanor, she was flawless. In a pearl gray suit and heels that never touched a drop of mud, she stood at the podium and smiled. "Mr. Westbrook is understandably confused," she said sweetly. "After so many years away, he's unaware of the progress this community has made. But let me be clear, all our documents are legal. All our development is approved, and Whispering Pines is here to stay." She passed out copies of the same forged documents, smiling, calm, lying. When one reporter asked about Frank Delgado, she deflected. When another mentioned the DOJ inquiry, she scoffed. "Bureaucrats love drama," she said with a laugh. "But the law's on our side." She turned to the crowd. "Don't let a disgruntled landowner scare you. Whispering Pines is your home." The crowd clapped, but a few didn't, and I was watching them. The next morning, Olivia got a burner text from a number we didn't recognize. "Meet me at the Overlook Trailhead, 11 p.m. Come alone." So I went. A figure stepped out of the shadows. A woman, mid-40s, jeans, windbreaker, face partially obscured. She handed me a flash drive. "I'm on the HOA board," she whispered. "Not everyone's a monster. That flash drive has the minutes of our closed meetings, including the one where Eleanor admitted the surveys were backdated." "Why are you helping us?" I asked. She hesitated. "Because I bought a cabin here. I believed in her. Now I realize I bought a lie. So did everyone else." Then she disappeared into the trees. The flash drive was gold. Recordings, notes, even scanned emails. One in particular stood out. "We need to move the northeast boundary line 120 farners. Frank will handle it. No one checks these things. Eleanor Quinn." Another, "Councilman Redfield has agreed to fast-track Phase 2. Wire the remaining payment to Hollow Creek under the standard LLC chain." And the best one? An audio recording. Eleanor laughing. "People think the law is about fairness. It's about who gets to use it first." Olivia compiled everything into a master file. 172 pages of evidence, exhibits, and sworn testimony. We delivered it in person to the Attorney General's office in the Capitol. This time, the response wasn't a maybe, it was a warrant. Within a week, subpoenas were flying. Redfield was placed under ethics investigation. Hollow Creek's records were seized, and a grand jury was quietly convened. Whispering Pines HOA's tone shifted overnight. They stopped returning media calls. The clubhouse shuttered for maintenance. And Eleanor? She disappeared from public view entirely. "Max," Olivia said as we sat on the porch one evening, "we have them cornered, but there's one last move." She laid out the plan. 1. Civil suit to reclaim ownership, damages, and demolition orders for every illegal structure. 2. Criminal referrals based on federal fraud, document forgery, conspiracy, and land theft. 3. Public campaign, not just to protect Whispering Pines residents, but to warn others. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said. I looked out at the land. The wind rustled the grass. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled. "No," I replied. "It's about everyone they thought they could silence." That night, a message arrived. A printed letter slipped under the door. "Back off or this gets ugly. Some land isn't worth the blood." No signature, but I knew who sent it, and they had just made their final mistake. The courtroom was packed. Locals filled every bench. Journalists lined the back wall. Even a few Whispering Pines residents, their expressions wary, had shown up. At the front, Eleanor Quinn sat like a queen at the gallows, impeccably dressed, sunglasses perched on her head, not a hair out of place. Her legal team, 4 attorneys from a major firm in the state capital. On our side, me, Olivia, in a single document box packed tighter than a munitions crate. No suits, no theatrics. Just the truth. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the hearing to order. Eleanor's lead attorney went first. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "my client is the victim of an opportunistic vendetta. Mr. Westbrook, having returned after a long absence, discovered our thriving community and now seeks to dismantle it under the guise of legal technicality. He cited county approvals, claimed good faith investment, repeated the phrase legally filed easements no less than 7 times. Then he dropped the big one. We asked the court to recognize Whispering Pines as a vested community. To strip it now would be cruel and unconstitutional." The judge nodded slowly, then he turned to me. "Mr. Westbrook, your response?" I stood. "My name is Max Westbrook. I'm a former counsel to the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Land Access. I helped write the Federal Land Access and Conservation Act, the very law they're misusing to justify this theft." That got murmurs. Even the court reporter looked up. "I know exactly how easements work. I wrote the limitations that prevent them from being turned into development licenses. What Whispering Pines did wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy." I handed the judge a binder, in Exhibit A through J. Forged signatures, falsified surveys, fraudulent zoning approvals, all tied to Eleanor Quinn and her affiliates. The people who built on my land didn't just break the law, they re-engineered it, then sold the blueprints. Next came Frank Delgado, the nervous surveyor turned whistleblower. He described everything: the fake boundary changes, the orders to alter markers, the bribes. "They told me no one would ever check," he said, hands shaking. "They said it was just paperwork." Then Carol Anderson, tearful but composed. "They told us we had to sell. Then they built condos and doubled the price. We lost our land. My husband never recovered. And finally, the HOA board mole. She played the audio recording." Eleanor's voice filled the room. "The law's just a tool, and people like Max think it's a shield. But I've always preferred hammers." Dead silence. Then the judge leaned back in his chair. "I've heard enough." It took him less than an hour. The court declared the easement invalid, the development illegal. Ownership of the land was fully restored to me, with damages awarded for lost use, environmental harm, and defamation. But there was more. Pending criminal investigations, state and federal, against Eleanor Quinn, Councilman Redfield, and several county employees. Warrants were issued, bank accounts frozen. As deputies moved toward her, Eleanor stood up, icy and smug. "This isn't over," she snapped. "You think you've won? These people need homes. I gave them paradise. You're taking it away." I didn't respond, but Olivia did. "No," she said. "You took their money, their peace, and their trust. We're giving it back." Here's the thing. I could have had it all torn down. The court gave me that right. But I didn't. Instead, I called a community meeting. This time, in the old barn on the edge of my property. I stood in front of the Whispering Pines residents, many of them victims in their own way, and told them the truth. "You were lied to. You were sold something built on fraud. But I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to offer a way forward." Together, we formed a land trust. Every buyer who'd purchased in good faith was offered a new lease, one that respected the land, the law, and the community. We rewrote the HOA charter from scratch, this time transparent, democratic, and without Eleanor's iron grip. Whispering Pines became a real neighborhood. Not a con, not a scandal, but a second chance. It's been a year since the verdict. Eleanor is serving a 15-year sentence for fraud, forgery, and racketeering. Redfield pled guilty in exchange for testimony. The land is healing. The creek runs clear again. The hayfields are green. And on the ridge where the cabins once blocked the sunset, we built a community garden. Kids play there now, the kind of thing my father would have loved. Some nights I sit on the porch, coffee in hand, and watch the lights twinkle from the new Whispering Pines. It's no longer a monument to theft, it's a lesson. The law doesn't protect the loudest voice, it protects the truth. And sometimes it just takes the right person to remind everyone how powerful that truth can be. Karen thought she won, but then I dropped the lawsuit of the decade. She lost the land, the power, and eventually her freedom. And that's what happens when you weaponize an HOA against the wrong person. If you've got a nightmare neighbor or an HOA horror story, send it to us. This is HOA Karen Files, where justice isn't just served, it's notarized, filed, and enforced. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned, because next time, it might be your HOA that gets exposed.